the most disfavored new god, the most disfavored new gods, a most disfavored new god, the most disfavored new goddess, the most disfavored new goddesses, a most disfavored new goddess, the most disfavored old god, the most disfavored old gods, a most disfavored old god, the most disfavored old goddess, the most disfavored old goddesses, a most disfavored old goddess, the most disfavored greater god, the most disfavored greater gods, a most disfavored greater god, the most disfavored greater goddess, the most disfavored greater goddesses, a most disfavored greater goddess, the most disfavored lesser god, the most disfavored lesser gods, a most disfavored lesser god, the most disfavored lesser goddess, the most disfavored lesser goddesses, a most disfavored lesser goddess, the most disfavored greater spirit, the most disfavored greater spirits, a most disfavored greater spirit, the most disfavored lesser spirit, the most disfavored lesser spirits, a most disfavored lesser spirit, the most disfavored major god, the most disfavored major gods, a most disfavored major god, the most disfavored major goddess, the most disfavored major goddesses, a most disfavored major goddess, the most disfavored minor god, the most disfavored minor gods, a most disfavored minor god, the most disfavored minor goddess, the most disfavored minor goddesses, a most disfavored minor goddess, the most disfavored superior god, the most disfavored superior gods, a most disfavored superior god, the most disfavored superior goddess, the most disfavored superior goddesses, a most disfavored superior goddess, the most disfavored inferior god, the most disfavored inferior gods, a most disfavored inferior god, the most disfavored inferior goddess, the most disfavored inferior goddesses, a most disfavored inferior goddess, the most disfavored ancestor god, the most disfavored ancestor gods, a most disfavored ancestor god, the most disfavored ancestor goddess, the most disfavored ancestor goddesses, a most disfavored ancestor goddess, the most disfavored descendant god, the most disfavored descendant gods, a most disfavored descendant god, the most disfavored descendant goddess, the most disfavored descendant goddesses, a most disfavored descendant goddess, the most disfavored descendant god, the most disfavored descendant gods, a most disfavored descendant god, the most disfavored descendant goddess, the most disfavored descendant goddesses, a most disfavored descendant goddess, the most disfavored transcendent god, the most disfavored transcendent gods, a most disfavored transcendent god, the most disfavored transcendent goddess, the most disfavored transcendent goddesses, a most disfavored transcendent goddess, the most disfavored future god, the most disfavored future gods, a most disfavored future god, the most disfavored future goddess, the most disfavored future goddesses, a most disfavored future goddess, the most disfavored present god, the most disfavored present gods, a most disfavored present god, the most disfavored present goddess, the most disfavored present goddesses, a most disfavored present goddess, the most disfavored past god, the most disfavored past gods, a most disfavored past god, the most disfavored past goddess, the most disfavored past goddesses, a most disfavored past goddess, the most disfavored god, the most disfavored gods, a most disfavored god, the most disfavored goddess, the most disfavored goddesses, a most disfavored goddess, the most disfavored half god, the most disfavored half gods, a most disfavored half god, the most disfavored half goddess, the most disfavored half goddesses, a most disfavored half goddess, the most disfavored vessel, the most disfavored vessels, a most disfavored vessel, the most disfavored person, the most disfavored persons, a most disfavored person, the most disfavored image, the most disfavored images, a most disfavored image, the most disfavored belief, the most disfavored beliefs, a most disfavored belief, the most disfavored thought, the most disfavored thoughts, a most disfavored thought, the most disfavored word, the most disfavored words, a most disfavored word, the most disfavored action, the most disfavored actions, a most disfavored action, the most disfavored situation, the most disfavored situations, a most disfavored situation, the most disfavored circumstance, the most disfavored circumstances, a most disfavored circumstance, the most disfavored relationship, The most disfavored relationships. A most disfavored relationship. The most disfavored number. The most disfavored numbers. A most disfavored number. The most disfavored formula. The most disfavored formulas. A most disfavored formula. The most disfavored symbol. The most disfavored symbols. A most disfavored symbol. The most disfavored color. The most disfavored colors. A most disfavored color. The most disfavored thing. The most disfavored things. A most disfavored thing. The most disfavored way. The most disfavored ways. A most disfavored way. The most disfavored place. The most disfavored places. A most disfavored place. The most disfavored time. The most disfavored times. A most disfavored time. The most disfavored event. The most disfavored events. A most disfavored event. The most disfavored result. The most disfavored results. A most disfavored result.